Otherwise, I'm extremely excited to welcome Aliyah Khan for this talk titled Black Literary Islam in the Caribbean, Autobiographical Writings of Enslaved Sufi West Africans in Colonial Jamaica and Sufi Poetry in Guyana. Guyana, I never know how to say it.
It's Guyana.
In the Caribbean. Aliyah Khan is Associate Professor of English Language and Literature and Afro-American African Studies at the University of Michigan. And I'm especially interested in hearing her take on Sufi poetry, given her English literature background. One of the reasons why we picked this book for discussion here in this series is it's really bringing something new to the table. Until now, people in ISITA orbit or in ISITA, Islam in Africa subfields are here more from historians, anthropologists, and occasionally political scientists, but they never hear, almost never hear from literary studies experts. And we're especially excited to have Aliyah joining us today. Her new book is, if you have not heard of it, Far From Mecca, with Rutgers University Press, is just out. It's been widely discussed, and I expect to see many reviews, many positive reviews. It is bringing so many new things to the conversation about Islam in Africa and its diaspora. And those of you who have read the blog she published on the Program African Studies website already know how wide-ranging and have a good grasp of the implications of her argument and the new material she's bringing to light. And without further ado, I will let her explain the project, the ideas, and let us know more about her work on this brand new area, I think. And of course, I will recommend to buy her book, Far From Mecca. Very nice title. With Rutgers University Press, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, right. Aliyah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the book plug. I'd like to first thank Professor Zakaria Ahmed Salem and Northwestern University's Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa and the Program of African Studies for inviting me to speak today. This talk is based on my recently published book, Far From Mecca, as Professor Ahmed Salem said, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, on the history, literature, politics, and music of the Muslim Caribbean. I'll speak today for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So let me begin by sharing my screen with you. So first of all, here's where we'll be focusing on geographically. I always like to start with a map. So here are the Caribbean islands, and you see the little stars next to the places that are of primary interest to us, the Caribbean islands of Jamaica and Trinidad, and the South American country of Guyana, which is part of the Anglophone Caribbean community by virtue of the fact that it was colonized by the British. Demographically, politically, culturally, and especially linguistically, Guyana has much more in common with the English-speaking Caribbean islands than with its Latin American Hispanophone geographic neighbors. For example, the populations of Trinidad and Guyana are almost evenly split between the descendants of the majority who worked on the sugar plantations, that is, enslaved Africans, and 19th and early 20th century indentured laborers from India. Other ethnic groups form much smaller minorities. In the Caribbean, Islam is historically considered to be a religion of the Indo-Caribbean descendants of those Indian indentured laborers who went to the Caribbean between 1838 and 1917. Something like 6 to 10% of indentured Indians may have been Muslim. The rest were mostly Hindu. But there is also a significant history of African Islam in the region. I'll begin this talk by noting some Muslim history in the Caribbean, including the multi-ethnic participation in the 19th century Muslim colonial festival of Taja or Hussein in Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica. Then I'll discuss the Islamic writings of two West African men enslaved in Jamaica in the early 1800s, Muhammad Kaba Sarkonugu of Ivory Coast and Abu Bakr al-Siddiq of Timbuktu, Mali, as well as the Sufi-influenced religious poetry of Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson in 20th century Guyana. I'm interested in establishing a genealogy of Afro-Caribbean Muslim literature, so I'll argue that these men's literary works are linked across a transnational migratory century and a half by a concern with Muslim Sufi ideas of the hidden, batin, and other political religious principles of West African Islam. Though Hopkinson, as a Caribbean poet, is also concerned with questions of how the Guyanese landscape differs from that of the island Caribbean. So how many Muslims are there and were there in the Caribbean? In 1970, that is post-independence from England, the number of Muslims in Guyana peaked at 9.1% of the overall population, and in Trinidad at 6.26% of the population. These numbers have decreased as a result of migration to England and North America. In the early 2000s, Muslims were 13.5% of people from Suriname, and that includes Javanese and Indian Muslims, and they were a statistically negligible 0.04% of Jamaicans. You can see from this 1969 Guyanese newspaper ad that Caribbean and South American pilgrims from countries like Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, and Barbados were already traveling together to the Hajj and had a sense of themselves as one regional branch of the Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community. Muslims are certainly a religious minority in the Caribbean, but they're not an invisible one. On July 27, 1990, for example, 114 armed members of the Muslim organization, the Jamaat al-Muslimin, led by Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, seized control of the government and national television station of Trinidad and held parliament hostage in an attempted coup that lasted 6 days before their surrender to the army and the police. In my book, I argue that this event was something regionally akin to the US's 9/11 moment, in the way that it altered perceptions of Muslims in Caribbean public discourse. So that's the present day. But how many enslaved African Muslims were there in the Americas? That story actually begins with the North African and Iberian Moriscos, or Moors, who accompanied Spanish and Portuguese explorers on voyages of discovery to the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Moriscos, like Muslim African victims of the transatlantic slave trade, did not leave direct Muslim descendants. Historians Michael Gomez and Edward Curtis and Sylviane Diouf suggest that there may have been tens of thousands or 10% of enslaved Africans in the Americas who were Muslim. As difficult as it is to estimate the overall numbers of Africans who embarked upon slave ships and later did not survive the Middle Passage, it is impossible to know how many enslaved Africans might have been Muslim. What we do know is that though a continental religious minority, there were Muslims of many ethnicities and tribal affiliations living in the West African, Senegambian, and Guinean slave trading regions. Many of them were Sufi. Sufism, as you might know, is the so-called mystical branch of Islam, of the whirling dervishes and the Persian poets Jalaluddin Rumi and Omar Khayyam. In the form of tariqa brotherhoods, Sufism has held strong in West Africa from the 15th century onwards, even when falling out of favor elsewhere. Literary West African Islam reached a height in the 15th and 16th centuries, with 150 to 180 predominantly Sunni Quranic schools in Timbuktu, international engagement with Sunni Egyptian scholars, and travel to the Arabian Hajj. Sufism arrived in Timbuktu from the North African Maharam region in the 15th century. There were a number of literate Muslim Africans who wrote autobiographies who were known to their contemporaries in the United States. There are far fewer such texts in the Caribbean. One of the Caribbean texts is from 1817 Trinidad, written by Muhammadu Aishatu, a Hausa, an imam from Gobir in what is now Nigeria. He was a soldier from the 3rd West Indian Regiment, which consisted of men who after 1807 had been pulled off of slave ships and freed if they agreed to fight for the British in the Napoleonic Wars. David Trotman and Paul Lovejoy write that a significant minority of the soldiers in the regiments were Muslim, partly as many may have come from ships traveling from the heavily Muslim Bight of Benin in the Gulf of Guinea. By dint of their literacy and educations, some enslaved Muslim Africans were treated better on plantations and were given positions like driver and bookkeeper more often, much more often than non-literate and non-Muslim Africans. Enslaved African Muslims in the Americas left literature, as I said, and some cultural traces, but their genealogical descendants, their children, their grandchildren were not directly Muslim. Imagine the impossibility of generationally maintaining Islam, and of course, the all-important literary and oral study of the Quran under conditions of chattel slavery. However, as a result of conversion or reversion, which sometimes went hand in hand with 20th century Black nationalists and Pan-African politics, there are several continuous generations of Muslims of African descent in the Caribbean and North America now. The most historically visible instantiation and the metonym of Caribbean Islam is the Shia Muslim festival of Maharam that became Taja or Tazia in Guyana and Hussein in Trinidad and Jamaica during the 1838 to 1917 period of Indian indentureship following the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. This festival, which commemorates the early Islamic battle of Kabbalah and martyrdom that is important to the religious division between Sunni and Shia Islam, was also celebrated in Jamaica and Suriname. Taja or Hussein was a multi-day religious celebration featuring a public procession of large and small model tombs. You can see them there. Those are called the Tajas. Also a red model of the crescent moon and a green model of the moon representing the brothers Hussein and Hassan respectively, and flags, singing, dancing, and drumming. In the earlier days of the festival, there was also stick fighting, known as gatkar, and fire dancing or fire pass. With the accompaniment of tassa and bass drumming, the Taja model tombs are carried toward a mythic extranational Karbala, the Iraqi city where Hussein was martyred in that early Islamic battle. The Tajas are usually taken into the seas to be submerged, a gesture sometimes criticized in the Caribbean as too Hindu. Taja or Hussein has Shia Muslim roots, and it is usually associated with Indians, those descendants of Indian indentured laborers in the Caribbean. But the illustrative point that I want to begin with here is that in the colonial period, the festival attracted both Muslim and Hindu Indian as well as African celebrants and participants. And that is partly why the British colonial government in Trinidad and Guyana feared it and attempted to stamp it out. This is that same festival, but in the colonial era in Jamaica. In 19th century Trinidad, Afro-Trinidadians found Hussein's carnivalesque street festival aspect familiar and began to take part in the procession as drummers, for which they were paid in rum or cash. They also sometimes carried the tajas, the model tombs, and were not required to be Muslim to do so. The working class Afro-Caribbean transition from partygoer to participant was even more pronounced in British Guyana, where Afro-Guyanese began as festival porters and drummers, but then started up their own parallel Good Friday festival called Black Taja. Taja was suppressed in British Guyana with Colonial Ordinance number 16 of 1869, which stipulated that no Taja processions will be permitted to enter the precincts either of the city of Georgetown, that is the capital, or the town of New Amsterdam. The ordinance imposed a host of other restrictions on pain of imprisonment or hard labor. In Trinidad, similarly, in an 1884 event that came to be known as the Maharam Massacre, police read the riot act to Jose processions entering the town of San Fernando in defiance of Trinidad's similar 1882 government ordinance. The colonial police then opened fire on the defiant but unarmed crowd, killing 16 and wounding scores more. These killings, not Trinidad's 1882 ordinance, which was less restrictive than British Guyana's, were what signaled the decline of the festival and Afro-Trinidadian participation in it in Trinidad. What remained of Hussein and Taja in early 20th century Trinidad and Guyana, after colonial restrictions and the uncompromising hostility directed toward the festival by Presbyterian missionaries, then fell out of favor with mainstream Sunni Muslims who look down on the festival's Shia origins, its irreligious festive atmosphere, and the alleged idolatry of the Taziadari, the model tomb procession. This festival has certainly survived in St. James and Cedros in Trinidad and has undergone an inter-ethnic 20th century revival there. At its colonial height, says Frank Coram, Taja or Hussein was an intriguingly flexible arena for interracial and interreligious participation, providing a Muslim avenue for cultural exchange between Black and Indian residents of Guyana and Trinidad, who were usually pitted against each other in the colonial labor economy. I begin with this point. Religion in Guyana and the Caribbean is actually partly a product of British colonial attempts to suppress creolization and religious syncretism, and not something that should be framed as a natural connection. In the rest of this talk, I will focus on transatlantic migratory Afro-Caribbean Islam, on, as we've discussed, the autobiographical religious texts of two enslaved West Africans in Jamaica, and on the Guyanese poetry of Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson. As I've noted, my interest is in establishing a lineage of Afro-Caribbean Muslim literature, partly in service of disproving the notion that Afro-Caribbean Islam begins simply with conversion in the 20th century. Our first author, Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu, alias Dick, alias Robert Pert, alias Robert Tuffet, alias Muhammad Kaba, alias the Mohabbetan in various literature of the time, was a native of Buka in northern Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast. He arrived in Jamaica enslaved in 1777 at the age of about 21. He died in 1845, still in bondage in Jamaica. Kaba wrote an Arabic autobiographical and theological treatise around 1820. It's Arabic, but it's also Ajami, transliterated, they're transliterated words in various African languages into Arabic. The manuscript is untitled, but translators Paul Lovejoy and Yassine Dadi Adun have dubbed it the Kitab al-Salat, or the Book on Praying. His name, as I've said, was Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu. The patronymic Kaba suggests that he was likely a Senegambian Mande, or Mandinka, of the Jakanki merchant and clerical diaspora. His immediate clan, the Sakanugu, were an important clerical family noted for teaching the Islamic sciences and associated with the tradition of Sufi scholarship founded by Sheikh Salim al-Suwari in the late 15th century. Ivor Wilkes and other historians describe the Sufi Muslim West African Suwarian tradition as a branch of the larger Qadiriya Sufi Brotherhood that had a learned, pacifist, and quietist orientation. After the 17th century decline of the Muslim-led Mali Empire, Kaba's people, the Suwari, embraced an ideology of pluralism, coexistence, and assimilation for Muslims living in non-Muslim lands. There's no way of knowing whether Kaba's understanding of his accommodationist natal tradition, Islamic tradition, allowed him to convert to Christianity in Jamaica. He was in fact baptized as a Moravian Christian in 1813, but the interesting thing is that he wrote this text, the Islamic Kitab al-Salat, after he was baptized as a Christian. Kaba also reported mystic prophesying dreams, a Sufi phenomenon that drove his Christian conversion. Perhaps he then felt that Allah endorsed his taqiyya, or prudence, which is an Islamic theological and jurisprudential concept permitting the concealment of one's religion if there is a threat to one's life or well-being. In considering Kaba's conversion to Christianity and theorizing his nonetheless continued adherence to Islam, I emphasize first that the Kitab, which is essentially an autobiographical manual on practicing Islam, was written at least 7 years after his Christian baptism. Second, that Kaba was a Suwari Qadiri West African Muslim from a tradition revolving around accommodation in a non-Muslim society. And third, his own words in his text suggest that he was grieved by the material and religious circumstances in which he found himself. Kaba addresses his manuscript in the beginning to the Jama'atul Muslimina wal Muslimat. That is, He called on the Muslim congregation or assembly of men and women while speaking as one of them. He concludes part 1 of his autobiography with the wrenching sentiment represented here. The book is finished. The last day of writing by the hands of the Abd is Friday. The Jews refer to the name of the one who owns the writing as Muhammad Kaba Sakunugu. I am Muhammad Kaba Sakunugu. I do not know anything of the knowledge of Al-Bahr. My memory is corrupted. I am not finding science. I have started asking for pardon day and night. I ask for pardon for every situation. Abd is usually translated as slave or servant, including in the sense of Islamic submission to Allah. It and its derivative, Abid, can also be a racist anti-Black slur in the Arabic-speaking world. Kaba implies that he is a slave within by choice to Allah and without by force to whites in Jamaica. Al-Bahr also has a double meaning. It literally means sea, but refers specifically to any man of science or one who displays a wide range of knowledge. It's also in Sufi theology, the sea of knowledge. When Kaba says that he does not know anything of the knowledge of Al-Bahr, it is not because he never did, but because after decades of enslavement, as he says, his memory is corrupted and he is not finding science, maybe the Islamic sciences. Kaba's knowledge of the Sufi Suari Qadiriya West African Muslim way, his birthright, has become fragmented in Jamaica, but he nonetheless attempts to set it on paper for posterity. We can ask, of whom is he asking pardon day and night? He mentions his Islamic teachers later on in the text by name. He is also perhaps asking their pardon for his forgetting of religious knowledge and for his conversion. But this lament also carries the sense of asking God for both answer and forgiveness for the hardships of his enslaved existence. Kaba here is already an old man, around the age of 64 on a plantation, thinking of and welcoming death. He is a Moravian Christian, but still a Muslim in essence. In no way can Kaba be judged for his conversion by any Islamic religious standard that does not allow for the horror of chattel slavery. We can certainly argue that he did far more to preserve his Islamic heritage than most could under those conditions. Again, his manuscript. Kaba corresponded by letter with another enslaved Jamaican Muslim, in whom Magistrate R.R. Madden, an abolitionist Irish magistrate in Jamaica with a fascination for Muslim Africans. He was very entranced by the fact that they were literate. He took a great interest in this other African Muslim and helped secure his freedom. The second enslaved Jamaican Muslim was called Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, alias Edward Donnellan, and he was originally from Timbuktu, Mali. Magistrate Madden recorded Kaba's and Abu Bakr's letters to each other, claiming that both men's conversions were diffident and suspect. I'm quoting Madden. Kaba first writes a letter in Arabic to Donnellan and states that the purport of the letter is to convert Donnellan from Mohammedanism to the Christian faith. Madden, who is no fool, then exclaims, "But what is my surprise at finding the letter of the old man who is so anxious to convert his countrymen from the Mussulman creed, commencing in these terms: in the name of God, merciful and omnipotent, the blessing of God, the peace of his prophet Muhammad." So much for the old African's renunciation of Islamism. Madden, in his irony, correctly identified there the Basmala, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, most gracious and merciful, which begins each surah or chapter of the Quran except one. You can see that Basmala here in Kaba's text on the upper right. It is how he begins his text. In the same letters, Abu Bakr, the second enslaved Jamaican Muslim from Timbuktu, asked to be sent a copy of the Quran, even though he claimed to also be interested in Christian conversion. Abu Bakr eventually also wrote his own brief autobiography, and he, unlike his compatriot Kaba, returned to Africa a free man. I'll now turn to Afro-Caribbean Muslim literature and its Sufi influences in the 20th century. Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson, born in 1934 in New Amsterdam, British Guyana, was a Caribbean poet of the Brathwaite-Walcott independence and post-colonial generation, a Muslim convert, and a father of award-winning speculative fiction writer Nalo Hopkinson. But his work is far less well-known and studied than that of most of his contemporaries, like Derek Walcott. In my view, the reasons for his lack of recognition include that he did not publish prolifically, partly because he did not wish to publish his poems, partly because he suffered from serious kidney disease for the last decades of his life, and partly because Guyanese poets, hailing from a unique South American post-colonial space, have generally received less recognition in the Anglophone Caribbean than island poets. And then there's also the fact that Hopkinson's national contributions have been overshadowed by those of another one of his contemporaries, the Guyanese poet of anti-colonialism, Martin Carter. Hopkinson first published a book of poetry, The Four and Other Poems, in 1954, followed by a series of plays and two other poetry collections published by the Guyana Ministry of Education and Social Development. The volume, his main volume, Snowscape with Signature, collects many of his poems from 1952 to 1992 and was published in 1993, shortly after his death, though he was the one who chose the poems therein. Hopkinson's religious poems in the text, which include Ahad, Dhikr, Soul, Neither Fog Nor Flight, and Adhan, invoke medieval Sufi mystics and teachers from the medieval era to the 18th century. I'll discuss one of these poems a bit more shortly. The Jamaican poet and critic Mervyn Morris writes in his introduction to Hopkinson's Snowscape with Signature that Hopkinson's religious poems are perhaps his most distinctive contribution to West Indian poetry. Hopkinson's work is usually briefly listed in the histories of Caribbean poetry as simply displaying a formal educated thoughtfulness and stylistic discipline similar to that of his more famous contemporaries, including Edward Kamau Brathwaite and Derek Walcott. Such listings generally conclude with a brief word about his religion and religious poetry, in the vein of his entry in Edward Baugh's A History of Poetry in a History of Literature in the Caribbean, which reads, Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson became a convert to Islam, and the poems that come out of this development are distinguished by a near mystical sweetness and light, and provide yet another current in the stream of Caribbean poetry. To put it plainly, Caribbean literary critics do not know what to do with Hopkinson's religious poetry, as it engages with a religious current, Islam, that seems foreign to the Caribbean and to its majority Christian and African syncretic religions. So the critics speak of his mysterious Islamic sweetness and light, and defer analysis. Hopkinson's engagement with landscape, his distinction between island and continent, and his suggestion that geography produces distinct cultural being are typical positionalities of Caribbean writers. But Guyanese writers like Hopkinson, David Dabydeen, and Wilson Harris are particularly drawn to the anti-colonial nation-building symbolism offered by Guyana's diverse continental jungle, savanna, and riverine landscapes in which indigenous tribal people still live, its hinterlands. Hopkinson's pan-Caribbean life experiences and differentiation between the continental and island landscapes are reflected in his poems, which he says reflect two parochialisms. Quote, there are the Guyanese poems and there are the West Indian island poems. They're different because the landscapes in which they are set are different. I should say that Guyana is essentially on the equator. It's the country in which I was born. It's essentially on the equator and the landscape is Amazonian. In contrast to, the sea-bounded islands. There's a third distinct grouping of Hopkinson's poems that is different from the other regional two, as it is about his own soul searching and only sometimes engages with questions of Guyanese or broader West Indian post-colonial identity. That is his Sufi-inspired religious verse. Hopkinson converted to Islam in 1964. He was explicit about his engagement with the most famed Sufi poets, including Omar Khayyam, Fariduddin Attar, and Jalaluddin Rumi, occasionally naming them in his poems. Hopkinson, the poet, was concerned with the contradictions of faith and the binary struggles of Sufism, between materiality and spirituality, between ego and soul, between divine and profane, and between ecstasy and suffering. He too sought batin, the hidden, real truth behind what words seem to say. In Hopkinson's religious poetry, he entertains Sufi teachings that suggest those apparent binary oppositions ought instead to be framed as having the same root and source in the divine realm where the truth lies. The poems never quite come to a material or spiritual resolution or peace. The state of being seeker and observer in transit to unity with the divine is paramount. Hopkinson said in 1977 that his terminal illness had given him a consciousness of death with which he was living quite comfortably and beyond terror. Writing poems had become for him primarily an act of spiritual clarification. Here's a short example of one of his poems. In this poem, Hopkinson's Soul, Hopkinson, you can clearly see his Sufi poetic influences and techniques. I'll briefly read it. Ego must die so that the soul may be born, but ego is identical with the soul. Beloved, resolve in me Ad-Darqawi's mystery. You built it into the soul's architecture. On first glance, we already see the typical Sufi poetic invocation of the beloved, who may or may not be God. But the poem is also a reflection on the teachings of a more recent North African Sufi master, not Rumi, Khayyam, or the classic Persian and Arab poets who also influenced Hopkinson. The Ad-Darqawi mentioned in the poem is Moroccan, that is Sheikh Maleh al-Arabi al-Darqawi, founder of the Darqawiyya Tariqa, or Brotherhood of the Shadhili Sufi order. The Moroccan Sheikh, he died in 1823. In Sheikh's writing, his mystery, as identified by Abdurrahman Slayer Hopkins here, is that of the soul, and batin, that which is hidden. The Sufi and Islamic theological conflict between the hidden ruh, or the immortal soul self, and the nafs, the ego, psyche, or seat of worldly desires. According to the Sheikh, these exist together in the living person, and the jihad of life is the struggle between them and the fight to keep the nafs in check. This is a common Islamic, theological belief. In this, and not just Sufi, in this and others of Hopkinson's poems, the beloved is always God, who is called upon to help the speaker reconcile the conflict between ego and soul, as in fact, the resolution is already inbuilt by God into the soul's architecture. I'll conclude here. Kaba and Abu Bakr, as African men educated in Sufi traditions who had then been enslaved for most of their adult lives in Jamaica, also faced their mortality, made offerings of their words, and sought spiritual clarification in their writings. The Guyanese Hopkinson's contemporary poetry and engagement with Sufism provides a migratory continuity of Afro-Caribbean literary Islam that reaches across a century and a half to assure Kaba and Abu Bakr that though they were unable to practice their religion openly or even leave Muslim descendants, Islam remains a religion of the Caribbean. Thank you.
All right, thank you so very much. That was extremely interesting. So now off to the Q&A. And the way we do this usually is by people who want to ask questions, raise their hand. And then I give them the floor. Sometimes I miss some hands, raised hands, and Rebecca is there to help because her internet is slightly better than mine. All right, do we have any questions?
It's a fairly wide-ranging selection from the book, from the Hussein Taja Festival to, the African Muslims enslaved in Jamaica to, 20th century Guyanese poetry. It's fairly wide-ranging. So,
yes.
I'd be happy to answer questions about any of that.
I have a question about the material used in Arabic, especially that poem that starts with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa salli ala the Kaba's poem. So is this one of those serendipitous moments where you discover a text randomly during research, or was this text already in the public domain? Has it been studied before, or what's the story of this text and your story with this text?
It has been studied before. Yes, and particularly, it's actually just, I guess you could say it's been studied once before by Paul, there are a couple of articles on it by Paul Lovejoy, and the person who translated it or did the most work in translating it, Yassine Adoun. So yeah, there are some things out there, but you know, like the issue with this text and like many of the contemporary ones is that it requires somebody with really particular translation skills. It's not enough to know Arabic. It's certainly not enough to know standard Arabic at all. Like you have to, yes, you have to know standard Arabic. You have to have a working knowledge of Quranic Arabic, you know, the classical Arabic of the Quran. But then you also have to know some of the root languages with which these men were familiar, not just in their current versions, but they're like 19th century versions. So when I said Ajami, I meant, you know, you might have to be conversant with 19th century Hausa and Wolof in particular, which make an appearance in transliteration in some of these kinds of texts. So yeah, again, the work of translating it is very, very difficult, very specific, requires somebody who has knowledge of multiple West African languages, as well as various forms of Arabic, not just in their contemporary forms, but in their 19th century forms.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else has a question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan, and thank you very much to the conveners of this talk, Professor Salem. I really was very interested in the talk. I teach Arabic language and literature under the auspices of an Africana Studies program here at Vassar College in New York. So we are always interested in hearing, you know, about research happening all over, you know, the Africana world, and the connection that you made very clear today between the Caribbean and the migratory Islamic communities in the Caribbean really kind of made the connections between these two cultures very concrete, in fact, and it's not something that everyone immediately kind of recognizes or associates with the Caribbean, Islam in the Caribbean. And so I'm very curious to know whether in your research you've been working on more contemporary poets, writers of the Islamic faith, converts, reverts, or, you know, people of Islamic heritage currently anywhere in the Caribbean. That would be really interesting to me.
Yes, I definitely have. This chapter of the book, which is the first one, you know, it's essentially revolves around some historic texts as well as, you know, Abdurrahman's poetry. But yes, there are a number of if you look through some of the other chapters of the book and the bibliography, there are a number of other novels and poetry collections that I would recommend. But you know, one that you can start thinking about that I do write extensive, or two. Let's say one that I do write extensively about is one called Allah in the Islands by a writer named Brenda Flanagan. That one is interesting because it is essentially, you know, it's an allegory based on that coup that I mentioned, that Muslim coup that I mentioned in Trinidad in 1990. Flanagan, the writer, is actually, she doesn't say so anywhere where she talks about this work, but she's actually the sister of Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, who was the leader of this Islamic coup by the Jamaat al-Muslimin, which is actually predominantly an Afro-Trinidadian Muslim group, you know, affiliated with like Black nationalist politics of one kind or another in Trinidad. So that's an interesting place to start because it is this historical allegory that is based on this really interesting event, this really interesting Islamic coup in the Caribbean that received very little attention, but that it's very formative to understanding the way that the religion and the way that Muslims are perceived in Caribbean public discourse. You could start there, essentially.
All right. Maybe. Majina, do you hear us?
Yes, sorry, I was reactivating myself. Thank you so much for this talk. My head was really reeling at the end with all the connections that you made across eras and across territories. It was really great. I was wondering, so thinking of these connections across times, like I was wondering if in the more contemporary writings, you talked about Hopkinson's, but I'm sure there's other people, if there are references, let's say, to these enslaved Muslims from the 19th century, like whether in the, like, you know, citing some of the writings. I know there aren't that many writings, or if references to these figures are made, or if there's kind of like I guess a cut and people don't really know about these writings from the 19th century.
Razak.
Oh,
That's a really great question. You would think that there would be I think people have little to no knowledge of the existence of these autobiographical texts. I feel like, you know, in the United States, some of them have just been, you know, some of them have been recently brought to light and studied, in particular the papers of Omar Ibn Said, which are held by the Library of Congress. You can access his documents just online, like held by the Library of Congress, and I think people have started writing about it. But there's so little. There's almost I have not seen references in the fiction and the poetry, direct references to these people, like, you know, the two that I mentioned, as well as Muhammadu Aisha too. Like, I have not seen them fictionalized or, you know, put or you know, making an appearance in poetry or so on. Like I mean, this is about genre too. Like, their work is studied as, if studied at all, it's studied in this autobiographical vein. You know, their autobiography texts, and then the fiction and the poetry is much more concerned with like contemporary conditions now. Like, how do Muslims in the Caribbean engage with this coup that I just mentioned? How do they engage with the specter of terrorism? How do they engage with perceptions of Islam in the 20th century? No, they don't particularly address the you know, these Muslims that I mentioned from the 19th century and earlier. Those people, you'll find them in, you know, you can read them as autobiographies, or you can find them referenced in histories. But somebody should write something, right?
right. We have
maybe
four more
maybe
questions. All right. Do you have a follow-up on that, Majina? No?
No, I just dropped in the chat after your question on that text by Mohammed Kaba. I think there's an article that just came out in 2019 of some scholars who found in Ireland another writing by him, a speech that he gave, I think, on the occasion of emancipation in Jamaica. And it's exactly as, you know, as Dr. Khan was describing, like they had to sit and, I guess, rewrite what he would have written in, you know, that form of Jamaican speech in Arabic to try to determine what he actually said. It's a really interesting article. I can drop a link if people are interested.
Oh yes, do that. Thank you.
But yeah, no, that's it. But thank you for the talk again. It was really great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Majina. Next question is from Brian Maxey. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but forgive me.
No problem. You got it right. Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, I'm Professor Khan. My name is Brian Maxey. I'm a PhD student at Toronto, and actually I was at Michigan just for my master's recently. You may have seen me around at some point. But yeah, so thank you for the wonderful talk. It was really, really engaging and enlightening. My question was actually in relation to the Yassin Abu Bakr and also the kind of Trinidadian Free Mandingo community, and to what extent do you see them having engagement with that history in Trinidad? And then also, I know just some of my very cursory side research, I've seen references to there being like discourses between that community and Muhammad Yunus Bath, their kind of imam, and then like folks in you know, seeking freedom, right, from the English crown through the text, right? So actually having writings. And so to what extent if you're familiar with any work that's going on there, or if the group itself in Trinidad identifies himself in relation to this kind of tradition of manumission in Trinidad.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Brian. That's a really interesting question. You know, I am much more familiar with Muhammad Yunus Bath's community, you know, which did not leave a direct communal successor that you can define as Muslim. I mean, the Free Mandingos are their kind of own thing. There are historians who trace some Free Mandingo traditions That includes like Sylvia and Dios, like particularly the custom and like Mandingo and other, not Mandingo, Maroon communities in Jamaica and other related communities of free people who have given particular attention to food customs, like specifically the one in the one called Saraka, like the giving of like bread, which is also like a giving of blessings during holidays. That is one tradition that some Maroons and some of these other kind of like free people communities seem to have that is linked to Islam. You know, there are certainly historians who try to prove that it is directly Islamically linked. It's just very hard to, it's just very kind of hard to prove. That's Sylvia Diouf talks about this in her book Servants of Allah. That's one concrete cultural link that I think that you can make. But it's like I feel really hesitant to speculate, right, on things that maybe they're Muslim, maybe they have some kind of Muslim antecedent, or maybe they just have some kind of general West African antecedent.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So next question is Samina Haji Tabassum.
Thanks for coming.
Hi, Aliyah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So this is an area I'm not very familiar with, but I was wondering if you've had some comparisons with Muslim writers from Guyana and looking at that intersection between writers from the Caribbean versus Guyana, a different port.
Again, there is not very, you know, one of my projects is to establish a kind of general canon, literary canon of Muslim writers in the Caribbean. And I can't say that there's so much out there that you can establish definitive differences or a definitive like sub-canon of Guyanese writers who, you know, you can put in this tradition of like continental writing versus the island writers. There are just not many out there. And the majority are actually, you know, Trinidadian, and then they're Jamaicans too, at least historically speaking. But I would say no, there's just not enough out there. I think there's just starting to be enough works written by and about Muslims in the Caribbean for you to even point to there being kind of a general canon at all of Muslim Caribbean writing. I also want to say though that I think of it as like a Muslim Caribbean canon of literary and musical production. Like sometimes it's just very difficult to separate out, you know, all of these cultural manifestations. And I don't know that you would necessarily even want to. There's the amount of or the kind of like recent flowering of music in the Muslim Caribbean that is certainly linked to other Caribbean musical traditions is something else that I think we also need to pay attention to. And it's one of the things that I looked at alongside of looking at literature in this book, because you know, the first person who, or second person who asked a question, the book that I suggested, Professor Mihiri, the book that I suggested, Allah in the Islands, also references a number of calypsos that were written about that coup, about that Muslim coup. And the calypsos are the way, you know, politicized songs are the way in which Trinidadians engaged with their, you know, changing ideas about Islam. It's not and like the role that Islam could possibly have in the Trinidadian public sphere. It didn't happen through literature, through writings. It happened through the music. So I'd like to think of all that cultural production together. To answer your question, I'd like to think about all that cultural production together. But I can't say that there is enough. There's so much of enough out there of Guyanese Muslim writing that you can say that there is just one. There's just a definitive canon. You can just point to these generalities, like, yeah, they're concerned with the Amazonian landscape as opposed to, you know, the islands. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Next question, Muhammad Fraser Rahim. Please, go ahead.
Dr. Khan, thank you so much for this. This was incredible. I really appreciate it. I had two quick questions. One, I appreciated the linkages of the highlighting the 1813 Moravian conversion of Muhammad Kaba, and just thinking about linkages into the US. I'm finishing up a project right now in the Gullah Geechee community, And I'm asking this, you might not have the answer for it, but I'm gonna ask anyway. There is something I'm working on that hopefully can get authenticated, that it looks as though there might be something that I've unpacked of maybe a woman autobiography. And I would be curious if you know, again, there's a lot of work behind this. So I'm still being careful on how I'm saying that, because I'm doing the unpacking on it as we speak. And as you know, these stories of Said, et cetera, sometimes we've stumbled across them. I'm curious, have you found anything at all of any women stories in the colonial period, like we've seen the work of Muhammad Kabah, et cetera?
That's an excellent question. And I searched, the autobiographies or the autobiographical writings that I'm familiar with. And of course, there are multiple of them from the Caribbean and from the United States. They are all by men. I could not find, it's not because they're not out there, but I couldn't really find any that were written by women. I mean, the most you'll find is the most that I found is references to, one of the questioners, Brian asked, references to like the way they cook, as preserving some kind of, maybe Islamic tradition, this thing about Saraka. But no, I have not found any autobiographies that were written by Muslim women. It's not, though, I want to say explicitly that it's not because Muslim women were not educated in the schools of Timbuktu or in these 19th century Islamic schools. That's not true either. They were, African Muslim women were educated in those Quranic schools, maybe on separate tracks, but they were. Nonetheless, I just know, I mean, if you can uncover one, that would be amazing. I would love to read about it.
I'll email you, but again, thank you so much. Yeah.
I want to add actually one more thing to your question, which is, because it is, it is a document, or a US document, I have not studied Bilali Muhammad's Ben Ali diary. I have not studied it myself. That came out of Sapelo Island in Georgia. But it'd be interesting to see what you would find there, because it's clear that Bilali Muhammad, as the leader of the Sapelo Island Georgia community, was himself a Muslim, and that's Gullah Geechee culture now.
Right, thank you. Next up is Professor Amidou Sani from Nigeria. Yes, we can.
I just want to find out from Aliyah whether she has come across materials of multilingual nature, Patois, Arabic, and some other languages. And if she has, what subject matter do such materials treat? But of course, I'm also I'm interested in verse, what I would call a Patois verse, Jami verse, written either by women as well. Has she come across anything of such, and what subject matter?
Mm-hmm. No, again, a good question.
Do such materials treat? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's related to the question that I think some other people have asked about the kind of multilingual nature of these texts. No, I haven't come across anything that is explicitly in Jamaican patois or Caribbean patois and combination of that, plus there are no written texts that I know of that are combination of Jamaican patois plus these plus Arabic plus Ajami. But Medina actually just pointed out that there is a speech. Let me see if did you put the link in it? The link in the chat, that there may have been a speech that is a combination of those kinds of things. Again, for these people, and you can, for people who are on the plantation in 19th century, just came from their command of English is Jamaican patois, or it is these like Caribbean Creoles, but there's no standardized way of writing those. There's to this day, no standardized way of writing those languages. Jamaica, we people have tried. You can find the Bible in Jamaican patois, or the version that I grew up speaking in Guyana is called Creolese, but there's no standardized orthography. So it would be difficult to find a text from the 19th century for that reason and for many other reasons. They are not literary languages as such.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? I have a question of my own. I was wondering about the reception, the local reception in Guyana and the Caribbean in general of this legacy, or even in the more recent production that you talked about, for example, for the contemporary poet.
So I had a book launch in Guyana that was supposed to be, the book just came out last year in the middle of the pandemic, right? So it's kind of a casualty of that situation. I had a book launch that was planned in Guyana, you know, like with the Caribbean Studies Association, with the University of Guyana, that was planned for last summer, or the summer that just passed us. And of course it was canceled because of COVID. It's been rescheduled for this summer, but virtual. And you know, it's different than seeing how the reception is in person of some of these materials. But I was able to present some of it at a talk in Guyana in October of 2019, and people, you know, there were people there there were one or two government ministers there, you know, in the way that in these places, like, government ministers might show up to anything, including an academic talk. So yeah, there were one or two of those people there, and you know, of course, really random interested people who had a lot to say, of course, about their own experiences of, you know, Islam in the Caribbean and so on. But they were really interested to hear what they spoke of as history that they themselves did not know about their own people and culture. Particularly this festival of Hussein Taja, which, you know, is, people don't, like, in Trinidad, people know it. In Guyana, people don't know it because it really was stamped out by the British, even though it was this early instantiation of, you know, cooperation and so on, and cultural connection between Indians and Africans. People were interested, I would say, and it's an interesting, I would say, thing on a personal note. You know, as an academic who is from somewhere else, and then, you know, like, living and writing in the United States, to go back to your home country as an academic and have your relatives come to your academic talk and tell you why you're wrong. Like, what they think of Islam, like what Islam is truly about, as Muslims do. You know, but no, people were very interested and engaged, and they just, you know, they think of it as something that they didn't know about their own cultures. Thank you.
All right. So this is somehow a hidden aspect of the local culture. So many people outside of the community know about.
Sorry, can you repeat that question? I was looking at the chat, the questions in the chat.
Oh, you're right. So answer those first, because my questions are not a priority. So did you spot any questions in that chat? Because we're almost have to conclude.
I was just scanning it. No, but people actually seem to have some really great resources. There are a couple of people who are offering resources.
Yes.
Further information.
Yes, absolutely. If there are no further questions or no one want to ask another question, I think it's time to conclude, because our time is up. This went by very quickly. That's a testimony to the interest of the topic and your presentation of it. So I would ask the remaining people in the audience to join me in thanking you, Aliyah Khan, for a wonderful talk. And once again, I refer people who want to know more or learn more about this topic to read your book, Far From Mecca, with Rutgers University Press. Thank you so very much, everyone. And next talk is, I don't know when is that actually, but Rebecca just sent, I think it's in April. Anyway, it's April. We'll be talking about the Khoja of Tanzania. April, how, when?
April 7th.
April 7th, we'll have Iqbal Akhtar from Florida International University presenting his book about the Khoja of Tanzania. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day or night, depending on where you are.
Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Yeah.
And asking great questions.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you very much.